Hello.
My parents called me selfish and disowned me for buying myself a house instead of my sister. I had spent the last 10 years of my life climbing the corporate ladder, making sacrifices that most people my age wouldn't even consider. Weekends? Forget about them. Late nights? A given. All of it was for one singular goal: to buy my own home, my sanctuary, something that would be mine and mine alone. Growing up, that idea always seemed like a distant dream. But now, at 30, it was finally within reach. My job in finance paid decently well, but it wasn't without stress. Numbers could be unforgiving, and deadlines were relentless. For years, I'd poured myself into building a stable foundation, ensuring I'd never have to rely on anyone else. Independence wasn't just a goal. It was a necessity. The thought of having a place to call my own, a place where no one's expectations or judgments could reach me, was what kept me going during the grueling workdays. But my family, they had a different perspective. Being the eldest of two, I'd always been cast as the reliable one, the fixer. My younger sister, Lizzie, hadn't exactly had an easy run of things. At 28, she was already a single mom of two, struggling to make ends meet after a messy divorce. It wasn't entirely her fault. Life just seemed to throw more curveballs her way than she could dodge. Still, my parents never hesitated to remind me of my responsibility to help her out whenever I could. Family comes first, they'd always say, which was code for Lizzie comes first. Over the years, this unspoken rule had become a constant presence, a shadow over every decision I made. Birthday gift for the kids, covering a missed rent payment here and there, even contributing to Lizzie's daycare costs where her ex decided to forget child support. It was never-ending, but this time was different. This was my dream, and I wasn't about to let it slip away. When I found the house, it felt like fate. It was a modest two-bedroom with a cozy yard in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where you could hear birds chirping in the morning instead of honking horns. It had just enough space for me to feel comfortable, but not so much that it felt overwhelming. It was perfect. I didn't tell my parents right away. To be honest, I wasn't sure how they'd take it. Knowing them, they'd see it as selfish, spending money on myself when Lizzie needed it more. But why did my success always have to come second to her struggles? For once, I wanted to do something purely for me. No strings attached, no guilt trips. So, I went through the process quietly. I toured the property, negotiated the price, and secured the loan, all without a word to anyone in the family. When I finally signed the papers, I felt a rush of pride and relief. I had done it. No help, no handouts, just me and my hard work. The day I got the keys, I sat in my car for a moment, staring at the house from the driveway. It didn't feel real. This was the first big thing I'd done entirely for myself. It was liberating and terrifying. Part of me wondered if I was being reckless. What if my parents were right? What if I should have waited and pooled my resources with Lizzie to get something bigger for all of us? But no, I pushed those thoughts aside. This was my decision, and I wasn't going to let anyone's expectations ruin it. I'd planned to tell my family over dinner that weekend, thinking it would be a celebratory moment. But as the hours ticked closer, a knot began forming in my stomach. I knew what was coming. My parents would guilt me, maybe even lash out, and Lizzie would sit there silently, letting them fight her battles for her. I'd been through this routine too many times to expect anything different. Still, I held on to a sliver of hope that this time would be different. Maybe they'd surprise me. Maybe they'd actually be happy for me. I shook my head and laughed at myself for even entertaining the thought. That hope was as fragile as a soap bubble, ready to burst at the first hint of disapproval. As I sat in my car that evening, staring at the house that was now mine, I couldn't help but feel torn. On one hand, I had achieved something monumental, something I had worked tirelessly for. On the other, I couldn't shake the feeling that this victory was about to come with a heavy price. And the worst part, I wasn't sure if I was ready to pay it. The dinner started like any other, a mix of small talk and clinking silverware. I'd timed my announcement for when everyone was settled, thinking it would soften the blow. When I finally shared the news about buying my first home, I expected at least a smile, maybe even a congratulations. Instead, the room fell silent, and my mother's fork clattered against her plate. Her first words weren't about the house itself, but about Lizzie. She leaned forward, her expression a mix of confusion and something else I couldn't quite place. "Why didn't you buy something big enough for your sister and the kids?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to cut through the air. My chest tightened. I'd seen this coming but had hoped against it. My father chimed in before I could respond, calling my decision selfish and short-sighted. He reminded me of Lizzie's struggles, painting a vivid picture of her scraping by while I indulged in what they clearly saw as a luxury. Lizzie, for her part, kept her eyes on her plate. Her shoulders hunched slightly, and she fidgeted with her napkin. It was as though she wanted to disappear, to escape the tension that was rapidly building. I couldn't blame her. The weight of their expectations wasn't new to her either. I tried to explain, calmly, logically. I told them how long I'd worked for this, how I'd scrimped and saved, sacrificing countless moments of joy to make it happen. It wasn't that I didn't care about Lizzie or the kids. Of course, I cared. But for once, I wanted to do something that was just for me. My mother's response hit like a punch to the gut. She said they'd always assumed I'd step up for the family, that I'd be the one to sacrifice. Her voice carried a mix of disappointment and disbelief as she spoke about how Lizzie would never have this chance on her own. My father nodded in agreement, adding that family meant putting others before yourself. They didn't say it outright, but the message was clear. I was failing them. The tension was palpable. My mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and my father's jaw was set in a way that made it clear he was done hearing my side. Lizzie finally looked up, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I almost wished she would, that she'd step in and defend me, or at least acknowledge that this wasn't my burden alone to carry. But she stayed silent, and the moment passed. After dinner, the atmosphere remained heavy. My parents retreated to the living room, murmuring to each other in low tones. Lizzie stayed behind in the dining room, clearing plates and avoiding my gaze. I lingered, unsure if I should say anything or just leave. The silence between us felt as loud as any argument. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She thanked me, not for the house, but for thinking of myself for once. She said she understood what it took for me to make this decision, even if our parents didn't. But then she added something that caught me off guard. She asked me not to tell them about our conversation. She didn't want them thinking she'd approved of my choice, or worse, that she didn't need their support anymore. It felt like a betrayal wrapped in gratitude. On one hand, she acknowledged my struggle. On the other, she was asking me to keep it hidden, to perpetuate the narrative that I was the selfish one. It stung more than I cared to admit. As I drove home that night, the weight of the evening settled over me like a thick fog. The house, which had felt like a triumph just days ago, now felt tainted. My parents' words replayed in my mind, each one a tiny dagger chipping away at the pride I'd felt. And Lizzie's request, her quiet plea to keep the peace at my expense, added another layer of complexity I hadn't been prepared for. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that the decision I'd made for myself would ripple through our family in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. The knot in my stomach tightened as I realized that the hardest part wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The days following that dinner felt like walking on a tightrope stretched over a pit of guilt and frustration. I knew I had to address the situation, but every attempt seemed destined to backfire. Still, I decided to try. I called my mother one evening after work, hoping that without the heightened emotions of face-to-face confrontation, we could have a rational conversation. I started by acknowledging their concerns, explaining that I understood why they felt Lizzie needed more support. I emphasized that buying the house wasn't an act of defiance, but a decision born from years of planning and hard work. I told her I was still willing to help Lizzie financially in smaller, manageable ways, just not through giving up my own dreams. Her response was immediate and cutting. She dismissed my reasoning, insisting that it was never about money, but about the principle. She said that my actions showed where my priorities lay, and it was clear to her that family didn't come first for me. That line hit harder than I'd expected. I'd spent years prioritizing everyone else, and now that I'd done something for myself, I was being cast as a villain. It was a no-win situation. Feeling cornered, I reached out to a friend, hoping for a perspective outside the family bubble. My coworker Chris had always been a straight shooter, someone who could cut through the noise and get to the heart of things. When I laid out the situation, he didn't mince words. He told me my parents were putting me in an impossible position, weaponizing guilt to control my decisions. He said I had every right to draw a line, and that sacrificing my happiness for the sake of principle wasn't sustainable. His words were a lifeline, a validation I desperately needed. Even Lizzie, who had remained largely silent during the dinner, reached out. She sent me a long message late one night, thanking me for always being there for her, but assuring me that she didn't want me to feel obligated to solve all her problems. She admitted that our parents had a tendency to overstep and amplify issues, making everything seem more urgent than it was. Her words were a relief, but they also deepened my resentment toward our parents. If even Lizzie didn't expect this level of sacrifice from me, why were they so insistent? Despite these moments of clarity, the conflict only escalated. My parents seemed to double down on their position, growing more vocal and accusatory. They dismissed my offers to help Lizzie with smaller financial contributions, labeling them as token gestures. Paying a month's daycare bill or covering her utilities wasn't enough in their eyes. They wanted a grand gesture, something that would prove I was committed to the family. Things reached a boiling point when my father called me one evening. His tone was colder than I'd ever heard it. He accused me of being selfish, of turning my back on the values they'd tried to instill in me. He said my actions showed a lack of respect for the sacrifices they'd made to give me a good life. And then he dropped the bombshell. If I didn't make the right choice, they'd have no choice but to reevaluate our relationship. The words hung in the air like a bad echo. It was the ultimate ultimatum, a threat that struck at the core of everything I'd worked to avoid. I wanted to believe he didn't mean it, that it was just another tactic to push me into compliance. But the tone in his voice suggested otherwise. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. As I ended the call, I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. I'd expected resistance, but not this level of hostility. My parents were drawing lines in the sand, and I was being forced to choose between my own happiness and their approval. The weight of that choice settled heavily on my shoulders, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alone. Parents organized a gathering of the entire family to discuss the situation. They framed it as an opportunity to resolve things, but I knew better. This wasn't about resolution. It was about control. The dining room felt smaller than ever with everyone crammed in, the air thick with tension as my parents began to speak. They wasted no time laying out their grievances, openly criticizing my decision in front of everyone. My mother's voice wavered with practiced sorrow as she talked about how I had abandoned the family. My father followed up with pointed remarks about my selfishness and how my actions were tearing us apart. The words stung, not because they were true, but because of the way they twisted the narrative to suit their own agenda. Some relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. A few tried to offer muted words of support, suggesting that maybe I had a right to make my own choices. But their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming silence of those who chose to stay neutral, unwilling to get caught in the crossfire. I'd had enough. The weight of their accusations, their constant need to put me in the wrong, was unbearable. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and finally let out everything I'd been holding back. I spoke about the years I'd spent working tirelessly, not just for myself, but for the family. I reminded them of the countless sacrifices I'd made, the moments I'd given up to ensure everyone else was okay. And now, for the first time, I'd chosen to do something for myself. Was that really so unforgivable? My mother's response was predictable. She repeated the same line she always had. Family should always come first. But this time, I didn't let it slide. I told her that true love and support didn't come with strings attached, that family shouldn't mean sacrificing your own happiness to meet someone else's expectations. The room went silent, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. Then came the moment I'd feared and somehow expected. My father, his face a mix of anger and disappointment, stood up and declared that if I chose to prioritize myself over the family, then I was no longer a part of it. The ultimatum was clear: fall in line or be cast out. The words hit me like a gut punch, but beneath the hurt, there was a flicker of something else: relief. I took a deep breath and made my decision. I told them I wasn't going to give up my house or my dreams to satisfy their demands. I wasn't going to let guilt dictate my life anymore. Their reaction was immediate and harsh, with my mother turning away as if she couldn't bear to look at me and my father shaking his head in disgust. The divide between us felt final, a chasm too wide to bridge. As I left the house that night, the cold air biting at my skin, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was sadness, of course, for what I'd lost, but there was also a sense of freedom, a weight lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I'd stood up for myself, and despite the pain, it felt right. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to walk, and that was enough. Life after that family gathering was quieter, but the echoes of that night lingered in unexpected ways. Lizzie and I kept in touch, though it clearly irritated our parents. She'd call or text occasionally, sharing updates about her kids or asking for advice on work. In one message, she said I'd inspired her. Watching me stand up for myself had shown her that it was okay to set boundaries and prioritize her own happiness. That simple acknowledgement meant more to me than she probably realized. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into making the house feel like home. I painted the walls, assembled furniture, and planted a small garden in the backyard. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been buried under years of guilt and obligation. The quiet mornings with a cup of coffee on the porch became my sanctuary. It was a kind of peace I'd never known before. At work, I found a renewed focus. Without the constant pressure of meeting my family's endless expectations, I had more energy to invest in my career. My co-workers noticed a change, commenting on how much more confident and relaxed I seemed. Even Chris, who had been my sounding board through all of this, said it was like I'd finally stepped out of a shadow. Then, about 3 months after the fallout, my mother reached out. She sent a message, short and formal, asking for help with some bills that had piled up. For a moment, I hesitated, the old urge to fix everything bubbling to the surface. But I caught myself. I wasn't the same person who would drop everything to make their problems disappear. Instead, I responded carefully, saying that while I was willing to support the family, it wouldn't come at the expense of my own needs. Her reply was curt, and I could feel the tension even through the screen. But I didn't let it pull me back in. I'd drawn my line, and for the first time, I felt strong enough to hold it. Lizzie later told me that our parents were still upset, framing my boundaries as selfishness, but she reassured me that I'd done the right thing. Her words were a reminder that even when the path is lonely, it can still be the right one. As the months went by, the sting of that family rift began to fade. I stopped waiting for their approval and started focusing on the life I wanted to build. I joined a local hiking group, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. I met new people, started exploring hobbies I'd set aside, and for the first time in years, I felt genuinely happy. The last conversation I had with my father was brief. He called one evening, his tone as stiff as ever. He asked how I was, but it felt more like a formality than genuine interest. We exchanged a few pleasantries before he brought up the family again, hinting that the door was always open if I was ready to do what was right. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I wished him well and ended the call, feeling a strange mix of closure and detachment. By the end of that year, I realized something profound. The family I'd grown up with might never fully understand or accept my choices, and that was okay. The life I was building, one filled with peace, purpose, and authenticity, was enough. Setting boundaries hadn't torn my world apart. It had stitched me back together. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving.
Bye-bye.